Welcome to the first Dragon Ball Heroes animation breakdown. 10 years ago, Bandai were desperate for a Heroes anime, and instead we got Dragon Ball Kai. A decade later, and one finally exists, but probably not quite to the same scale that they wanted. And scale is exactly where I want to kick things off today, because I think it's important to understand what expectations to have with this format. Excluding the credits and the opening, which is literally just a repurposed hero commercial, there is about 6 minutes of content here. This is a promotional anime. It is, for all intents and purposes, essentially an extended version of the Heroes commercials we've been getting for the past 10 plus years. Like I mentioned in my breakdown of the character designs the other day, this is not going to be exceptional in any way. This is very much, and I use this term correctly, a low-budget, small-scale advert. I think the key animation list says it all, really. There are only 2 key animators here, and the one who is at the top of that list handles essentially 80% of the animation, and that is Yukihiro Kitano. For those who don't remember, or are maybe new to this channel, Yukihiro Kitano was one of the absolute worst supervisors on Dragon Ball Super. He was responsible for the ghastly episode 24 with Goku vs Frieza, the hugely disappointing episode 62 with Super Saiyan Rage Trunks, and he was so poor in fact that he was demoted once the series hit the Tournament of Power. However, in the animation supervisor and storyboard role, we have the series character designer Tadayoshi Yamamuro at the helm. Yamamuro's approach to supervision is a bit of a double-edged sword. He is infamous for entirely redrawing anything put in front of him into his style. That is a fantastic thing when you have very poor animators, but of course when you put good animators with very distinct traits in front of him, they're often erased with their interesting idiosyncrasies reduced or wiped away entirely. Thankfully, with Kitano here, you know that you're getting nothing but an upgrade with Yamamuro's corrections. You guys are well aware that I'm not a massive fan of his modern style, but Yamamuro is a competent artist and he's very fast. As a result, regardless of whether I like this style or not, it would be an outright lie to say that this art is anything other than consistent and polished from start to finish. So with that aspect acknowledged, let's look at this key animation. Kicking things off, we have the only other key animator here, Jin Inaba. He essentially sandwiches Kitano's work, as you'll see. Inaba was a staple of the Super series and was actually pretty decent, particularly with 17's Punch in episode 121. The work here is understandably nowhere near that level. This is about as rudimentary as it gets on the whole, but I actually really like the way he conveyed Whis' effortless dodging of Goku and Vegeta's attacks. He's using timing that makes his movement feel very floaty, and that's pretty effective for what's conveyed here. On the flip side, Yamamuro's storyboard is pretty bad. It showcases essentially everything I pointed out in the preview breakdown, and it's far and away the weakest aspect of the short episode. From shot to shot, this is pretty much Resurrection F 2.0. It is flat composition on flat composition, interspersed by characters stood on the edge of the frame, and Yamamuro's limited bank of shot choices are plain to see. He absolutely loves to frame things between people's legs. I'm sure you'll remember me pointing out how he constantly has characters raising their fists too. On one hand, this is an extended commercial, it doesn't really matter, but on the other, on something of this scale, you aren't going to have much in the way of exemplary animation, so you should be making up for that with interesting boards. There are some choice moments towards the end that I really like, but by and large, this is about as middle of the road as it gets. Moving on, let's talk about Kitano, because he's actually the strongest part of this episode by a mile. Since there's very little movement here, he makes up for this by going really heavy with his effects. I have said many times in the past that in spite of his issues with actual animation, I really do like the shapes he uses in his smoke and explosions. From the moment the two Gokus clash, you get this eruption of shaggy looking smoke with these quite angular shadows. My favourite section has to be where Goku dodges Xeno Goku's blast. I really like the way he's animated Goku kind of easing up and down, and the explosion on the cliff behind is pretty competent. I'm a big fan of homogeneous billows with interesting highlight shapes, so this is right up my alley. The scuffle that follows is equally as strong for similar reasons. The movement itself does have that awkward posing that Kitano's so well known for, but again, the effects are carrying these scenes far beyond what they really deserve. The big explosion reminds me so much of Miyuma's scene from episode 86 of Super, albeit with slightly less interesting shapes. As mentioned in the preview breakdown, the Kamehameha is honestly really poor. There's absolutely no weight behind any of these actions, and combined with the miniaturizing composition, this is, for me, the weakest section of the episode. At the very least, the aftermath does give us another glimpse at Kitano's reasonably pleasant effects. A long stretch of bland dialogue scenes later, and Jin Inaba comes back in to close things up with some lightning effects that are pretty much one-to-one with that 17 scene I mentioned earlier. This is also one of the few spots where the director's touch comes into play. This episode is directed by Ryo Number, and you would be easily forgiven for not knowing who that is. Number began on Super as an assistant production manager. He was in charge of planning until around episode 68. Later down the line, he became an assistant director, and now he's directing his very own, very short episode. He's created a bit of an atmosphere for the prison planet, but otherwise there's nothing particularly stand out. As a little side note, they are in fact using the filter from the Universe Survival arc. You can see that it's been turned up to 11 since we are on non-Earth worlds, and that was pretty much the standard in Super 2. The next episode is in 2 weeks, and it is looking to be pretty much the same quality. I think this is very much what we can expect from this Heroes anime. The same stock poses we've seen for decades, rudimentary animation, polished up by competently drawn but questionable designs. This is very much the Nickelback of Dragon Ball. It is bland, it is by the numbers. People like to exaggerate how bad it is, but I think at the end of the day, some of us secretly do enjoy the odd thing here and there. To be perfectly honest, this is pretty much the perfect place for modern Yamamuro. He gets to keep phoning it in, and it doesn't matter because it does the job. It sells what it's meant to be selling, it looks good to children, and it has no pretense of being anything more than that. At the same time, I hope you guys understand that I have to keep breaking this down with full honesty, but do keep in mind that that doesn't mean I'm not enjoying it, or that you can't enjoy it. Like I said, it's doing its bare minimum, and that's absolutely fine for what this is. If this were a movie or a TV show, then I would totally condemn it, absolutely, but for what is a glorified commercial, it's fine. It's absolutely fine. And that is pretty much all I have to say. I'm sure some of you are expecting me to really tear this to shreds, but there's just no reason to. It's just a fine commercial, and that is all it needs to be. Let me know down below how you felt about this first Heroes episode. Be sure to rate this video if you got something from it. Your ratings really did help my video from the other day. As always, subscribe if you're new, and I will see you next time.